Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's post-Week 4 Selection Committee episode where we figure out the best four teams in the country who would be most deserving of go to this year's inaugural college football playoff. I, of course, am joined by the SB Nation, or at least part of the SB Nation College Football Brain Trust, Bill Connolly, Jason Kirk, Spencer Hall, and Bud Elliott with 7 Ds at the end of Bud. Gentlemen, how are you doing? Everybody's doing well? Bill, I'm going to start with you because you are one of the people whose teams lost this weekend.
I didn't have to leave town to watch my team lose, though, so I feel like I won in that regard.
True.
This was a really strange situation where my boy Kevin Wilson beats my team. I didn't really that felt weird.
Fair enough. Jason, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good here. It's a nice day. It's like 85 degrees here. I don't know if it's getting cold up in your part of the world, but it's sure is here.
It's pretty nice, about 70. Spencer, how was your time in Tuscaloosa?
Oh, it was great.
You look like you drank and you ate well.
Ouch.
I mean, that was a compliment, I think. Did Spencer freeze, or is he just throwing me an unbelievable amount of shade?
Wow. You just turned him to stone.
I turned Spencer to stone. Bud, how are you? How was your Saturday evening?
It was eventful, but overall, it was pretty good. I caught up on a little bit of sleep this morning, thank God.
Good. I'm always glad to hear that because it's been a busy week for you. Bill, how was your top four taking shape after week 4? How has it changed? Has it changed dramatically in any significant way?
Well, I was waiting for Alabama and Florida State to give me a reason to put them in the top 4 instead of just assuming they would be there, and Alabama certainly has. Florida State has not, but Alabama certainly did this last week. I mean, almost literally handing Florida 21 points and winning by 21 points was impressive, even if Florida is not completely recovered from last year. So I was very impressed with them. I have them number 1. I have Oklahoma number 2. And then after that, it still gets mushy. I think Oregon's still probably number 3. And then, take your pick, A&M, Baylor, somebody like that. I'll say A&M just because I've had them all year.
Fair enough. Bud, you were at a game with another team that has been in this conversation to be in the top 4. Did that game do anything to increase or decrease or keep Florida State at a relatively same level with their inconsistencies? I would say would be a kind way of saying what happened on offense without Jameis Winston.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we saw some other guys step up for them, and then some other problems that we thought might be real also keep coming up. Their center's still not very good.
Right.
I'm not convinced their left tackle's healthy. I mean, if you look at how well he shut down Vic Beasley last year versus how he got whipped this year, pretty stark difference. So I don't think I would have them in the number 1 slot overall, for sure. I think they probably are still in at this point and would certainly be in if a real selection committee that took into account things like defending national champions, won 19 games in a row, just beat a ranked team without the Heisman Trophy winner and their best defensive player for the second half. So, but I wouldn't have number 1 right now. I think that's got to be either Bama or Oklahoma.
Okay, and who else would you have in your 4 if it's Bama, Oklahoma, Florida State, and...
I think Oregon because they've earned it so far with the Michigan State win. I mean, there are some concerns there, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Just chatting with you earlier, a true freshman left tackle and then a former walk-on on the other side, and the defense maybe not being quite as good as it needs to be. But the win over Michigan State was pretty convincing at this point, and I can't reward Baylor for playing nobody yet.
All right, and Spencer, you've been at 2 games that have been, I would say, pretty indicative of top 4 power in Oregon, Michigan State, and also Alabama, Florida. Where is your top 4 now, and how did this weekend affect that top 4, if at all?
It didn't. There really wasn't a whole lot that changed my opinion of what I saw overall. I think Alabama is basically the same team they were last year defensively with an improved offense. I do think that comes with a loss. I don't think they run the ball as well. I think just especially at the tackle spot, they don't rush block as well. So I don't know if that's going to be a weakness because, frankly, their passing game is so good and they have so many weapons that they might be able to do that. What you're going to see Alabama do for the rest of the year is just throw early, run late, throw early, run late. That's the blueprint for the rest of the year. But nothing happened this weekend to change anything. Oregon's defense is still suspect. I will point out, by the way, they probably faced one of the better 1 and 2 teams in the conference.
Yeah, that's fair.
In Wazoo. Wazoo gave them everything, including a bunch of stuff that they hadn't seen on film before. Yet their defense isn't real good, but we already knew that. Oklahoma, that's a Big 12 shootout. West Virginia being a new member and all, it still doesn't matter. That's exactly what you thought that game was going to be, and that's pretty much what I think most people thought the finish of that game was going to be. Like, the only surprise that happened outside of that, like, top four area is that Florida State continued, or that within the top four, Florida State continued to struggle in the rush game.
Yeah.
Right? They're kind of like Bizarro Alabama at this point. They're really sort of not dissimilar in terms of how their teams look. Right? Like a quarterback who's real productive, difficulty running the ball. I say difficulty, by the way. Derrick Henry still had 111 yards. But Florida doesn't count at this point. They're half a team.
All right.
At best.
Still, to perform admirably on offense against a well above average defense, I think is still something to be taken into account.
Not that secondary. It's a dumpster fire at this point.
True. Jason, has your top four changed at all? Did this weekend's activity and or scares with Oklahoma going to Morgantown, Oregon in Pullman, anything change your top four? Anybody closer, further away? Where are you at on this Monday afternoon?
Yeah, I got to bump Oklahoma up ahead of Oregon at this point just because they look so good every week. Still think Oregon can hang on to the number 2 spot for now. The Michigan State win, we can't overlook that just because they had a rough week in Pullman and still won by a touchdown. Next, Alabama is, it's at this point it's not even about including them because they're Alabama. It's including them because they're just blasting people. When you put up a Fiesta Bowl's worth of yardage on Florida, and when you try to let Florida compete with you, and Florida cannot, we're talking about one of the 10 most privileged and advantaged programs in the country that just is completely outclassed in every way. It's still mind-blowing how much better Alabama is than Florida. And fourth, I'm going to put in Auburn this week. The win at Kansas State didn't look pretty, but they beat them fair and square. They've looked good every week as well. Well, relatively good, as good as you can look in Manhattan, I should say. But I'm going to go with Auburn in spot 4 this week.
All right, Bill. Anybody close for you? Anybody get closer to that top 4? Anybody fall away? Obviously, a couple of losses outside of the top 4 of teams that we were looking at as potential contenders, including a team that you cover. Anybody closing in or falling away?
Well, I mean, obviously Auburn now has kind of a marquee win. They'll have opportunities for many, many more in the coming weeks. Their schedule is unbelievable. Who did I said A&M over Baylor, then Baylor. Baylor's right up there. I mean, they've been playing JV squads, but they've been just completely and totally emasculating and humiliating those squads. And so they get up there and they'll play real teams eventually. They have to go at Norman. And then Mississippi State just won at Baton Rouge, so they get counted for sure.
Fair enough. Spencer, anybody closing in or falling away from your top 4?
Falling away from my top 4, I think the trend continues that I think Jason's right. I think you do move Oregon down, particularly because I think just a spot, or maybe 2, just because they do look so troubled on defense that you're going to be able to move the ball on them consistently. Georgia just continues to, by virtue of the competition they've played and how they're doing, continues to fall away. I just don't think anyone in the SEC East belongs in a playoff discussion at this moment. And then I think that's it for my sliders as we go. I think the following weekend, not this weekend, but the weekend after next, we'll have an entirely different picture in terms of who's right there.
Yeah, there's 37 big games in week, I guess, 7 or 6. In week 6 there are a number of huge games. And I will say this about Oregon. The situation is right now that they are down their 3 best tackles on the offensive line and another rotation guy. The defense, I think, is in a position where they can be successful against most teams, especially ones like Michigan State, which there aren't a ton of in the Pac-12. But with UCLA and Stanford playing a little bit closer to what Michigan State does, Washington State sort of completely mitigates your front 7 in that they get rid of the ball so quickly. So any advantage you might have there is sort of mitigated quickly because they just force you to tackle in space every single play with some quick routes, and then they try to go with quick fades and routes that are sort of challenging deep. So I'm not terribly worried. Arizona's going to try to do a lot of the same. We saw Anu Solomon throw 73 times, but as for Oregon in the long term, they just need to, if they get healthier on their offensive line, I think that is probably a more important task than their defensive struggles against Wazoo. But anybody approaching your top four, anybody falling away from your top four, I guess especially as we see the schedule get essentially impossible in the SEC West.
I think it's got to start there in the SEC West. We saw Auburn go to Manhattan, Kansas, and beat a Kansas State team that I'm not sure how good they really are, but that's not an easy place to play.
Right.
You know, we sometimes underestimate how hard road games are for college teams. Their Week 1 win over Arkansas looks even better now that Arkansas continues to roll.
Yeah.
So I think Auburn has got to be very close right there. A&M has the one good win under their belt. Are they going to add another one? Because they played South Carolina and they whipped them, and then they've played essentially nobody else. And then Baylor, I don't have their schedule handy, but when do they actually play like a decent team, a team that's maybe projected to make a bowl or something like that?
I was going to say Texas. Texas is in early October, but I don't think that falls under decent team anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
that's the whole Big 12 though. Every single year. I mean,
True.
with the exception of Oklahoma and a few other teams that go out, the Big 12 doesn't really sort of submit its resume until like November.
The Big 12 has my favorite scheduling. It's the opposite of the SEC. All their hard games are at the end, whereas the SEC, they just sort of sprinkle them throughout, just enough to keep 8 teams in the top 9 or whatever.
So basically, at Texas on October 4th, and they got TCU at West Virginia, Kansas, at Oklahoma State, at Texas Tech, Kansas State. So they really, I mean, it is kind of scattered, but it doesn't start for a couple more weeks.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Jason, your top 4. Anybody approaching it? Anybody falling away that you feel like in the next couple of weeks? We talked about Week 6 being an enormous week. That you think there will be sort of chaos affecting your top teams?
Well, let's see. I'd have to look at the individual schedules for each of those teams. I know FSU's is pretty friendly for a while, so they could sneak up in there. Texas A&M is my next team out right now, just because that win over South Carolina is looking a little bit less impressive by the week. Steve Spurrier called his team embarrassing against Vanderbilt.
Yep. two kickoff return touchdowns will do that.
Points, but yeah, when Spurrier's using words like embarrassing, that tends to degrade a quality win just a little bit. A&M, obviously, they have a million chances to prove themselves, so at this point, we could say that 2 SEC West teams are that's a decent chance to actually happen in the actual playoff. So good luck with that.
All right, then I'll follow up with this, Jason, for you. This weekend's games, not a horribly challenging slate for a lot of teams, I guess, in the top 8, 10, 12 who are in that playoff conversation. Is there a game to you that you feel like could affect the top? Florida State, I want to say, has NC State. Oregon is off, obviously. I don't think Alabama has anybody of any consequence, or they might not be playing. But Auburn does get Texas A&M gets Arkansas. Do you foresee a way in which Arkansas will stay in that game for 4 quarters?
Sure. They've stayed in every game so far. They lost by a lot to Auburn, but that game was pretty close at the half. Sure. We have yet to see really what Texas A&M's defense can do against an offense that's just going to ram it down your face for 4 quarters. That was supposed to be South Carolina's game plan, but they couldn't get it going. So if A&M can hold up against Arkansas as well, then we can say that defensive front is, it's definitely where it needs to be. Elsewhere this weekend, UCLA, Arizona State, they're both like top 10-ish teams, but I don't think anybody's super impressed with them so far. Arizona State just because they haven't really played much of anybody in UCLA because they've looked awful every week. So maybe the winner of that on Thursday night, we start giving them some sort of a consideration if they look good. Oklahoma State, if they bounce back, if they take care of Texas Tech, then that makes FSU look better, and that sort of clarifies the Big 12 a little bit. But yeah, it's not the biggest weekend.
But one of the things you talk about when doing your gambling column each week and making your picks is overreactions. Do you think post Week 4 people are still overreacting or perhaps underreacting to any top or not perceived to be top teams at this moment?
That's a good question. I kind of wonder why UCLA is not being punished a little bit more for some really lackluster play so far this year against teams that really aren't very good. I mean, we saw UVA get pretty well handled by BYU. They came back and ended up covering the spread there. Other than that, I don't know. I don't know if anybody's really been overreacted to so much. Maybe A&M, I could say a couple of weeks ago, but then South Carolina went ahead and beat Georgia. So that's tough to say there. It's a good question.
I'll follow up with this then with A&M. Did we overreact to the defense against South Carolina, and perhaps that South Carolina really has looked pretty discombobulated and inconsistent. Are we completely sold after Texas A&M? And I'll pose this to everybody, really looked terrible on defense last year. Are we all fully buying in Texas A&M having a decent defense this year?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
I think we can say that there's a good chance they have a good enough defense, because if you can score 40 points a game, you don't need a great one. You know, if you can put it, like last year, they put up 44 points, I think it was, 45 on Alabama. If you can do that, if you can replicate that, you don't need a great defense.
Well,
Right,
Arkansas. Go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, if we're talking decent, they could have a decent defense, just not probably much more than that.
Arkansas is everyone's stress test in the SEC West. Like, Arkansas's job is not even necessarily to win; it's to measure whether you can perform under stress for 3.5 quarters, about under the most possible stress, which is this gigantic run game that just flops on you for 4 quarters straight.
Fair enough. I'll ask you this, Spencer. Michigan State, who you saw in person, and Ole Miss are sitting there at 9 and 10. Are either one of these teams? Obviously, they're good enough to continue to move up, just because of their individual defenses, and Michigan State's offense appears to be in pretty good shape most of the time. Are you buying either one of these teams as sort of single-digit and playoff challenging teams at this moment?
No, and that's because of the inconsistency for both teams. They're both teams that have a few different holes. Oregon managed to beat Michigan State primarily with its defensive line, which was shocking given what you saw last year.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of got away from the run, which Connor Cook is a great quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's still something that you're going to build your entire offense around without the presence of a Mark D'Antonio, thumping Big Ten, old school Big Ten style run game. I just don't think he doesn't seem capable of it yet. I know the Oregon game was a difficult circumstance, but when your offensive line's getting beat like that, that remains an issue. I don't think Michigan State's quite there yet. Ole Miss is one of the most baffling teams to watch in college football, because they have on both sides of the ball a lot of good players, 3 outstanding players, and then there are these spots that they simply don't have. They just don't have certain players. They have Kandichi, but they don't have anyone to pair him with. Mm-hmm. They have Bo Wallace, but they also have the other Bo Wallace, right? Because there are 2 of them.
Yep.
They'll both show up, and they're both entertaining for the objective viewer, but they're terrifying for an Ole Miss fan, because bad Bo is as bad as a quarterback can get, and good Bo is as good as one can get. So I think inconsistency for Ole Miss, and I think incompletion for Michigan State, they're probably looking a year down the road to sort of get back to that form and replace a couple of pieces.
Bill, Mississippi State had as much of a statement win this past week, going to LSU and not just winning, but winning pretty convincingly. I would say closer than the score indicates, just how well they played for about 3.5 quarters. Are you a believer, given what they are able to do on both sides of the ball and Mississippi State's ability to get up around 7 or 8, or do you feel like they're just not built strongly enough for the SEC West all year long?
Well, from a numbers perspective, they were already there. I mean, they were already top 15 last week, and so they barely moved up after beating LSU. So the numbers were kind of sold on them before. I needed to see a lot from their offense, and I mean, I think I saw it. I mean, LSU hadn't given up a point in quite a while, and
right.
They just ran all over them. So I mean, if Mississippi State can do that on offense, run well, get a couple big pass plays, and just let that defense hit people for however long they need to be on the field, that's a really good recipe. They're not Alabama here, but they really could. I mean, we should at least for now be taking them seriously until they give us a reason otherwise.
But one of the interesting things with Florida State this year, because I think everybody considers them to be a top 4 team at this point, is it's not just Clemson and Florida on their schedule right now. Notre Dame is sitting there as a top 10 team. How seriously do you feel like Notre Dame should be taken as a top 10 team at this time? And are they built in a way that could give Florida State trouble?
No, I think that Notre Dame is a lot better than what people thought they were going to be after they lost those 3 starters preseason.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they're necessarily a true top 10 level team. They really they didn't outgain Michigan by that much. Michigan had a lot of sloppiness with the turnovers and whatnot, and credit Notre Dame for being disciplined. But that's really the only game they've played where they've looked just crazy good against anybody.
Right.
I think they could give Florida State some trouble somewhat. but I think you need a better secondary probably to give FSU more trouble, and I don't know if they had those impact defensive linemen. Like Clemson, we talked a little about this last week, that I thought they were probably better on the defensive line than they showed against Georgia, and they really were last week. I don't know if Notre Dame has the exact formula, but they're one of the best teams remaining on FSU's schedule for sure, and they're going to get a lot of credit, too, because it's a Notre Dame name with very few losses next to it. So if Florida State beats them, it's going to help them in the eyes of the selection committee quite a bit.
Jason, if we're going to talk about a team out west that is not Oregon that you feel like could still be a threat, obviously USC doesn't have the best loss. Stanford looked kind of ugly not finishing drives and losing to USC, and UCLA, as you mentioned, has struggled early. If you had to bank on one team, be it those three or another team in the Pac-12, to be in this conversation in, say, 4 or 5 weeks, who is that team to you?
Two names there. Stanford, of course, which, if not for maybe the worst red zone performance we've ever seen against USC, would be undefeated in the top 10 right now and could still beat Oregon. And if Oregon's line can't heal up and all that, then the Ducks are in trouble there again. And the narrative continues, despite we swore it was dead.
Yep.
And then the dark horse team that I really like is Utah. And
wow.
Not to win the Pac-12 South necessarily, but just a team to keep your eye on.
To affect things.
To affect things, as they did last year, beating Stanford.
True.
But said this coming into the Michigan game, and then they looked even better than we thought they would. Just a really good defensive line, a quarterback who has made a ton of mistakes in his career and still gets a little goofy at times, but has calmed things down quite a bit. I like Utah to make some noise in the Pac-12 South, a division where I'm not really sold on anybody at this point.
Spencer, what's the most entertaining possible game in your eyes to be played January or whatever it is, 11th or something like that, in the national championship game, based on the factors that would make for just the purely best experienced fan base on field, best two teams? What to you is the biggest possible explosion?
The two teams that I would like to see on the field at the same time would be, I'd love to see Oregon there, because I'd just like to see Mariota given 4 quarters to go toe-to-toe with another team that I think probably couldn't stop him, and also probably has as many weapons offensively, if not more, particularly out of the backfield, and that's Alabama. So Oregon, Alabama, or Oregon, Texas A&M. Oregon, Texas A&M would probably be more fun.
Yeah.
It would also make a lot of people's heads explode.
Yep.
Because it would be abominable defense just for 4 quarters. And, that's great viewing for me. I fully admit my biases here. But I also just spent the drive home from Alabama trying to come up with some way to turn the SEC into a Mississippi State, South Carolina SEC championship game. So I've had atrocity on the brain since Saturday, so never mind me.
Now that Alabama-Oregon title game, people have been calling for that for like 5 years now.
Yep.
Is this the year we finally get it? Like that's been the whichever the biggest dream boxing matchup you can imagine. People have been calling for that for years.
Once again, Auburn beat Alabama to that as well. So there's that.
Or Eagle.
Or Bud, what is your most entertaining, just from like you sitting in a giant chair with adult beverages and you want to be entertained like some sort of citizen in a Roman Colosseum? What is that game for you?
I think it's got to be Oklahoma, Alabama, because this time Bama would not have the excuse of, hey, we were so disappointed we didn't play for the national title game.
Right.
Those two on the same field.
Stoops and SEC, yeah.
Yeah, you get Stoops and SEC. I think they're probably the best two teams in the country right now, so that's kind of an added bonus there. Teams that play very different styles, different kind of defenses, both play them really well. That could be a lot of fun. Jason,
what is your ultimate game?
Yeah, I mean, for 5 years now, it's been Oregon, Alabama. If I had to go something else, you'd probably say something like a Baylor, Michigan State, which I had that this week as a potential New Year's Bowl. But if we want to talk about contrasting styles, let's go all the way.
Wow. That would be something. Bill, what is your game, your dream game to sit and eat nachos and just be enamored in the glow of college football with?
Well, I mean, everybody else has said Oregon, Alabama. I'll say Baylor, Alabama. I mean, if we want to talk about contrast and just the attitudes on the field or on the sidelines, have Bryles on one end, have Kiffin and Saban on the other. That'd just be – I would watch just a camera view of them for reacting the entire game. Baylor A&M would be fantastic as well. No, I just really like that. you know, the teams we're talking about right now, a lot of them would have really fun matchups. OU is going to be a fun matchup up against just about anybody. Alabama's always interesting, unless we get like Alabama, Florida State, which would be a letdown at this point, I think. But no, just a lot of potentially interesting matchups here, and we'll see. When we're all talking about Alabama, Florida State in early December, we'll reminisce on September.
Yeah, I should point out that Baylor, Alabama would give us Sean Oakman against Cam Robinson, which is like 14 feet of football player. That's a lot of human. So that would be fantastic. Yeah, Oregon with a healthy line against Alabama to me is still it almost feels cultural at this point and a referendum on what college football should and could or shouldn't be. So I think that's always fun. And SEC fans are always super nice to non-SEC fans at tailgates. So there's that too. So I think that's the way to go.
I don't know if Oregon would get that treatment though. I mean, I feel like Oregon is like the
true
star looming over the SEC the way they talk about the Oregon football.
That is correct because I've always heard that from like when Arizona goes to LSU. Arizona fans are like, they were so nice to us. It's like, that's because they aren't threatened by you at all. They don't feel like their way of life is threatened at all. But
yeah, Oregon, there's something to it.
This weekend, walking out of the stadium, those Bama fans were doing that thing where they say, hey, thanks for coming, y'all. Drive safe. Like the ultimate. Yeah. They only do that to SEC. They do that to everybody. So just know that like that's the one universal SEC treatment, or Bama fans being like, bless your heart, you drive home. They don't say that if you beat them.
True. That is also very true. And because we did it last week, I'll go with the final question as a non-college football question. Hot pizza topping takes last week. Today's easy call was at a bar with ridiculous barbecue and all sorts of fun things. So here's my question to you. I'll start with Bill. What is the single best, I guess, topped bar food? So is it nachos, some sort of topped fry, some sort of topped tot? What is the best piled high shareable bar food?
If tots are an option, tots.
You can, if you're putting like chili cheese tots, or if you're like turning tots into like nacho type things.
Right. That hasn't caught on just everywhere yet, but if that's an option, absolutely tots.
What are you putting on those tots?
Well, I mean, anything you put on nachos, you can get super fun with barbecue or anything like that.
Tots.
Chili cheese is always fine. No, tots are top.
Okay. Jason, what is your number one topped pile of bar food?
I was gonna say nachos. I've probably eaten like 5 tons of those in my life, roughly. Mm-hmm. Just a number. But,
with or without sour cream?
On the side, not a huge fan, but a lot of people like it. And if we're talking about sharing, then you don't want it to get soggy, but you want people to have the option. But I just learned about tachos like a minute ago, so I'm going with y'all, man. Where are we going to get tot nachos?
You're all in. That's the national championship. That's Spencer. What is your favorite piled high bar food?
I opt out. Some jerk always puts cheese on them.
Okay, so a non-cheese.
There's not a single goddamn bar food that doesn't have cheese on it. Somebody always wants to put cheese on there because they're drunk and they're like, oh, put curdled milk on there. That'll be great.
I'm going to tailor this question for your specific palate. If we're going to put cheese and onions and chili and onions and avocado and all sorts and ground meat, whatever the case is, on top of some sort of starch, what is that starch?
Oh, it's got to be potato. So
fries, tots.
You know what? Tater tots. And you know why?
What's that?
They crunch. That's why.
Yeah. Well, they stand up to liquid.
They stand up to liquid. They crunch. And typically, you don't make them at home. You might have fries out of a bag at home, right? Or you might have potatoes. Sure. But nobody makes tater tots at home. I actually don't think they're allowed. I think it's illegal to make tater tots at home.
Yeah, they have the Ore-Ida bags that you can get at the market, but they're not the same.
Spencer, you're saying this with a diaper bag behind you? You don't make any tater tots at your house?
No, man. We gotta wait till they're like 7 or 8. They gotta earn the tater tot.
Bud, what is your number one piled high bar food?
I still think nachos over tots. They're a little more shareable, especially if you do them right, and they don't. Man, I guess tots can get soggy too.
Sure.
It kind of sucks going last in this question because everybody's taking this good answers.
Fair enough. We'll go one step further. What are on your nachos? Walk me through your dream nacho plate.
All right. Some kind of meat, so probably steak or barbecue. Not like a ton, but just enough to.
Complimentary amount.
Yeah. Jalapenos, cheese, not a lot of sour cream, if any. I don't think you need the sour cream with the cheese. That's kind of like over dairy.
The selection committee has taken, it feels like a group stance against sour cream.
Especially like if you put avocado and sour and cheese on there, you don't need. It feels
redundant.
Yeah, let's have a third fat on these steak nachos. That's what we need.
Right.
You got to vary your fats.
Yeah, I will say this, by the way. If you could take Pock wings and just cover them with anything, I will reach through them to get to the wing. So if you're like, I'll cover them with cheese and nachos, I'll be like, that's cool. I'm just going to bury down.
Fair enough. Well, I think that's as good a note to go out on as any. So, once again, Bill Connolly, Jason Kirk, Spencer Hall, and Bud Elliott, thank you very much for your time. Please, if you're watching this, leave either your top 4 teams or your middleist 4 teams in the comments, and we're going to continue the discussion there. Thank you again for watching. We'll see you next week.